Jack, you're in the Bastille. The party kept swinging all day and all night. The champagne was flowing, we was feeling alright. They were screaming for bread, things started to shake. But Marie Antoinette said, well, let them eat cake. Now the rabble wouldn't have it, they was angry and mean. They built a big old race, they called the guillotine. Then the people up shouted, well, have our day. Down with dirty water, give us Perrier.
Dear subjects, welcome to this new lecture. You recognize from this beautiful costume that I was today playing the parts, being James the First and not a magician, in case you were confused. Today we'll be discussing royal absolutism and rebellion together. This is basically a new episode of Don't Lose Your Heads. And we'll be talking about two kings. We'll start with myself, James the First. When you're such a good king that of Scotland that the English ask you to be their king as well. And we'll also talk about Charles the First, and the discussion about Charles will be to be continued. It is something that we'll finish discussing a week later. The period we'll be focusing on is the period between 1603 and 1642. Why 1603? Feel free to think about this for a second. Of course, it's because of the death of Queen Elizabeth. At that time, you had a fairly stable political situation. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated, but we'll say that it was fairly stable. And in 1642, what we've got on our hands is a civil war between the monarch and his parliament. So the question is, what the flipping heck happened? What occurred that led from a fairly stable political situation to a much more tense situation, i.e. the outbreak of a civil war? So two kings on today's menu, of course. Which one will lose his heads? That's the question. You've got James, his beautiful cape that you can recognize right here, and Charles as well, that we'll start discussing. Here's more pictures of me when I was a little child with my bird, and more pictures of Charles as well. Spoiler alerts. We'll see who loses their heads down the line. Today we'll begin with the Tudor legacy, and we'll discuss the fact that we end up with a stronger monarchy but also a confident political nation. In other words, two rival conceptions of power. This will lead us to discuss the fragile balance of power under James VI of Scotland, James I of England. We'll discuss succession, we'll discuss very tense relationships, politically speaking, and we'll talk about religious division as well. This will lead us to the possibility of a clash with political crisis under the reign of Charles I and his bad finances, clashes with Parliament leading to resistance, leading to a reaction on Charles' part, and fighting against Puritan reformers. Eventually, we'll discuss rebellion under the reign of Charles I. With the war in Scotland, the king isolated, being forced to accept the constitutional revolution of Parliament, and a fully fledged rebellion in Ireland. So we'll be talking about the British Isles. Now, the Tudor legacy is a legacy of rival interpretations of the political system. Sorry, issues with my cape. A stronger monarchy is the result of the Tudor periods, with Henry VIII's divide and rule tactics, divide and conquer, so to speak, that leads to rare rebellions from higher nobility, scarcity or rarity of rebellions on the parts of the higher nobility. We also have the union of church and state, of course, which means that the monarch is seen as the savior of the nation, from civil war, if you remember, but also foreign invasion. And of course, you know what I'm thinking, because you're thinking it too. You're thinking Spanish Armada, Elizabeth, and you're absolutely right. We also have a much more confident political nation, with economic changes, new social patterns that emerge throughout the periods. throughout the Tudor periods and at the beginning of James's reign. Though you have traditions of hierarchy and status that endured, that continued, rank and birth remain a source of power. The nobility and most of the gentry inherited lands and lived off the rents that were paid by their tenants. So that was their source of income. That's how they had money. The problem is that the rents were not often adapted to price inflation. Okay, let's talk about inflation. What's going on there? Why inflation? What we witness is a steady growth of the population from 1450 onwards. To give you an idea, between 1520 and 1640, the population was multiplied by 2. So you have more people than jobs, which means that you have lower wages because there's no shortage of workforce. It also meant that you had a stagnant output. So you have more people than food, which means higher demand for food, which means price inflation. So in the period between 1500 and 1640, the wages increased times 2. They were multiplied by 2, but the prices were multiplied by 8. So you see how that could be a little bit of a problem. Now, 80% of the population back then were rural workers who did not own land, and they were dependent on salaries, and they had to pay rents to their landlords. But there were not enough jobs, and as I mentioned, higher prices because of inflation. This meant that people relied on an economy of makeshifts. Makeshifts is how one can try and make do without having the best situation that there is, basically. De fortune, in a way. So the poorest were allowed, for instance, to use the common village grounds for their own subsistence. You can see a picture from Clapham Common. The name has remained, common meaning the common village grounds that people could use. Some enjoyed social mobility as a result of their capitalist success. So you see the growth of the urban middling sort. Middling sort, so it's simply middling sort. What does it mean more specifically, maybe you're wondering? Shopkeepers, craftsmen, professional people, such as lawyers, for instance, physicians. You can check out this beautiful family portrait. What we can say is that the old feudal bonds, as a result, the bonds of obedience that existed in feudal society that no longer existed, were getting weaker. Those that were at a clearer advantage were those who were not dependent on rents or on salaries, so they were self-sufficient farmers of the lower gentry. The tradesmen as well. Bankers that were involved in the expanding markets economy of the time. They hired cheap labor. They sold at higher prices, and then they could land their own profits, and in a way, ka-ching-ish. Yet, that being said, even though there was some social mobility, owning land was still the clearest indicator of status. There was a standard belief that it was a religious duty to make the land fructify, to make the lands bear fruits. That it was God's creation, it was honoring it to make it bear fruits. So many gentlemen farmers of the lower gentry placed a great value on hard work, planning, experimenting as well, sometimes even working the land themselves, something that is known as husbandry, the art, the management of the land. And that can lead us to wonder whether there was the belief in a Protestant work ethic, sort of hard work ethic. In any case, there was the intensification of agriculture. But the quickest way to make some profit was to enclose or to put fences put fences around the village grounds, the commons that we mentioned a second ago, and these are called enclosures, this process. Enclosed land was devoted to rearing sheep, not cultivation, to cut cost on labour. Because otherwise, if you cultivate, then you need to have people who work the land, whereas you can just put your sheep there, as one does. Or the land could be, the enclosed land could be subdivided and leased, rented to several tenants. So you get more rents, right? You make money out of that land that used to be the common land. Or you can sell it. That's like a privatization of the common. So you simply get rid of it and get some money once, and then it belongs to someone else. It becomes private land. So what we see is the triumph of the ideology of private property. Right? With very little job creation, whether it's just a sheep that's grazing the grass or something that's sold to someone else. We witnessed the beginnings of an agricultural revolution in terms of land tenure, type of produce, commercialization. You can feel free to pause for longer on this particular slide so that you can actually take a look at the percentage of lands that was enclosed throughout periods that spans the 16th century to the early 20th century, and you can try and figure out which years witnessed the largest percentage of land that was enclosed. No spoilers there. Most landowners just wanted to accumulate lands, to collect lands, and to live a life of leisure that was befitting to their rank, that was in accordance with their rank. Commercial capitalist agriculture only really took off in the 18th century, rather. When its profits became obvious, it was clear that it was bringing in a lot of money. And when new colonial markets opened, so when there was a cultural shift, so to speak. But in the meantime, most landowners just wanted to accumulate lands, to get the rounds, and to just live a life of leisure, petting their pets and accumulating land and goods. For rural workers, higher prices, plus lower wages, plus fewer jobs, plus the fact that the food was often scarce, sheep for wool, but not sheep for dinner, plus the fact that there was no more access to the commons because it had been enclosed. What this meant, and I'm going to be quoting someone here at that point, quoting a historian, going to be quoting Christopher Hill, whilst the living standards of men and women of the lower classes fell catastrophically, the living standards of sheep improved equally remarkably. So poverty became a massive problem, a real problem, and became an endemic problem. Many rural poor, now unable to use the commons, decided to migrate to the new towns in search of casual work. This led in turn to numerous anti-vagrancy laws, laws that targeted vagrants, those who were found wandering the streets, anti-vagrancy laws. Now, almsgiving, the fact of giving money or food or clothing, donner l'aumône, was not enough anymore. The problem of begging increased, and this meant that this also increased the duties and responsibilities of the government. Now, to govern the kingdom, the monarch depended on the collaboration of the elites of the country. This collaboration was voluntary collaboration, meaning that they voluntarily decided to help out. The crown had actually very little administrative muscle at the time, and it had limited financial resources, because the monarch had to pay both for government costs as well as his own household out of his own pocket, right? The crown administrators preferred a limited salary, or even no salary at all, if it meant that they paid lower taxes or that they paid no taxes at all. Government back then would have been mostly local, rather than central. The monarch appointed members of the local gentry to enforce government in the counties. What does that mean? People like sheriffs, for instance, or anything that had to do with law and order. Justices of the peace, lords, lieutenants in charge of the militia, etc., etc. They were unpaid and they served on a voluntary basis. But in exchange, they were autonomous. They could make the decisions that they wanted, and they got titles as well. So it was a sort of give and take, a sort of 50-50. When they didn't get paid, but they got something else in return. They got prestige. They got power over their own local communities. So basically what you have is a system of royal preferment or a system of royal patronage. But they now had to deal with the issue of poverty that I mentioned a second ago. In the past, remember, you had the monks, the monasteries that helped the sick. They helped the travelers, they helped the beggars, the orphans, but they were abolished by King Henry VIII, remember? Dissolution of monasteries. There's also the fact that the enclosures had terrible social consequences on the poorest. This led to the passing of the Poor Laws. Remember the 1601 Elizabethan Poor Law? We're still in the Tudor legacy period. Remember it because it'll come back next year. And you had two overseers of the poor, two people whose part was to handle the situation under the supervision of justices of the peace in each parish, which is an administrative unit. They collected money from the rich to feed the deserving poor, who could not work through no fault of their own. So for instance, widows with young children, those who were crippled, like they had problems with their legs, they were disabled, crippled. But that being said, help was minimal, and the so-called undeserving or idle poor, idle meaning they were seen as lazy, oisif, were suspected of avoiding work because they just simply didn't want to do the work, or they were being dishonest. And of course, these terms are between quotation marks because they're not an actual description of who these people were, but they were seen as undeserving. So poverty was seen as the result of an individual moral flaw. And often the response could be punishments. You can see here the whipping of a beggar. There was also the idea that the English were a Protestant elect nation with individual self-worth, a collective will, a covenanted people in a sense. The people were participating in the framing of religious reforms, in the legitimizing of those reforms, so acts of supremacy by Parliament. What do we learn from this, basically? Is that we have two rival conceptions. On the one hand, we have an ideology of order, centralized power around the monarch's divine right to rule, right? Subordination of the hierarchy of subjects, versus a new ideology, a community-based ideology with a coordination of powers between the monarch and the social elites. So rather than subordination, coordination. Plus relative local autonomy as well, government by consent. I mean, you agree by that, I mean that there would be an agreement. Consents, service in exchange for privilege. The monarch should be held accountable before God. One reason as well why King James VI of Scotland, first of England, has been remembered is that he was pretty much very scared of witches, and he began stirring up national panics that resulted in dreadful scenes of torture and death in Scotland in particular. Because that was horrible. There's a mental health break for you before we carry on. Bear with me. A fragile balance of power settled under James VI, James I. So we've now discussed the Tudor legacy, that tension. Let's talk about James. King of Scotland since 1561. At the time, he would have been one. And he succeeded his cousin Elizabeth I as James I of England in 1603. Here's a picture of me as a baby. Here's a picture of me looking fab. Union of crowns meant that England and Scotland shared the same king, but there was no union of states. Scotland remained an independent nation. It had its own capital. It was a nation that had its own parliament. It had its own church. That's important. It had its own legal system as well. James himself chose to reside in London. Here is a picture of James when his clothes arrive and everything looks great and just feeling too good, and you can't send anything back because everything fits fabulously. James's relationship with the political nation became increasingly strained, though. There was no major war, but James was a spendthrift, meaning that he spent a lot of money. So there was an increasing need for higher taxes. But since the 13th century, taxation had to be agreed on by Parliament. Remember Magna Carta? Taxation was not to be adjusted to inflation. Parliament's so-called ungenerosity with the taxes led to a tumultuous, tense, difficult relationship with James. In order to govern, James preferred relying on factions and individuals at court. But this was resented by local gentry. They didn't appreciate it. You had a few rivals monopolizing the king's favors, being given costly gifts as well, being offered things, which meant reduced favors for themselves and reduced local influence. And you remember how important the local gentry was during the Tudor period. So what we end up with is a court versus country animosity. You can see here by the sides the not so competent George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, James I's minion, so to speak, and lover, assassinated in 1628. We needed a bit of death and mayhem in this lecture. The gentry used their representatives in the House of Commons to voice their frustration, their grievances, leurs griefs. Parliament only consented to voting the king's taxes if he distributed influence, titles for instance, in an equal way and arbitrated local disputes in a fair way. But because of court favourites, James clashed with Parliament and he rarely called it Parliament becoming an event more than an institution. Therefore fears that it would disappear. If it's an event, it's something that happens, but it's not an institution that needs to take place regularly. So the parliamentary class started seeing itself as a counter-power. So you end up in a vicious circle, a sort of catch-22. And this was not helped by doctrines of divine right monarchy. Now, if we look back, in medieval Europe, there was a mystical belief in the divine nature of the king's person as God's representative on earth. For instance, there was a belief in his ability to cure the sick, as you can see on the slides. But the divine nature of the king's political actions were purely theoretical. In reality, there was very little physical control of the territories by the kings themselves. There was the idea of shared power, disputed power. Now, what we see, however, is a reinforcement of actual royal power in the 16th century and in the 17th century. This led to the belief, for instance, Spain, in France, of course, that God's will was also expressed through the king's political actions, that the political actions of the king, not just him curing the sick, but the decisions he made as king, politically speaking, were the expression of God's desire and will. To oppose the monarch's power was therefore to oppose God's power. So the monarch could not share his power because it was God's power. During the wars of religion, the development of a new idea, the idea of a strong ruler to arbitrate between competing interests, developed a sort of undivided sovereignty, as Jean Baudin explained in Le Six Livres de la République in 1576. That's how it was theorized. A strong ruler to avoid division. James VI, James I, also wrote about the absolute power of kings in books such as Basilicon Doron, which literally means the royal gifts. James had clashed with the Calvinist Church in Scotland, who denied kings an absolute power. So you see tensions that are arising in Scotland as well. But unlike the French king, sort of the epitome of absolute divine rights monarchy, unlike the French king who had the financial means of absolute, thanks to the permanent taxation and the sale of public offices, James was actually quite broke. He didn't have much of a penny to his name. His absolutism was only symbolical as a result. For instance, see this illustration of James as King Solomon appointed by God in a painting that is to be found in Banqueting House in London. There were also religious divisions with the Act of Uniformity in 1559, remember it, Lecture 3, which led to the obligation to obey the National Church of England, a Protestant church which kept Catholic hierarchy and ceremonial. So it was a compromise via media, was the expression we used. But there was underground resistance on the part of Catholics who refused Protestantism and did that in secret because the consequences could be quite bad. So within the Church of England as well, you had a clash. So on the one hand, you have Catholics versus Protestants, and within the Church of England, you had Anglicans, Protestants who approved of the Catholic aspects of the Church of England, and Puritans who were hard-line Protestants, Calvinists who disliked the Catholic aspects. Whenever there's a compromise, you're bound to make some people unhappy. Puritan was used as meant as an insult, with the idea of purifying the church from Anglican ceremonial, church decoration, because it was seen as too close to Catholic idolatry. Statues, gold, paintings, or just God. You can see that illustrated in the two pictures with the interior of St. Paul's Cathedral in London and a Calvinist church in Holland. And you can see the glaring difference between the two. Now, the Anglican ceremonial was a way for the hierarchy of bishops to assert social control. That was quite different from the Calvinist Puritan doctrine of spiritual equality of all men, hierarchy or equality. James I, although he'd been raised a Protestant, opposed Puritan pressure for reform because, because it was a risky gamble. Puritanism was seen as too egalitarian, was potentially revolutionary. If you say that there's spiritual equality of all men, you might find yourself with people disliking the hierarchy that is in place. If the church became too Protestant, potential disagreement of converted Catholics to Anglicanism could resurface. So there was a fear of revival of Catholicism, plus fear of potential war of religion all over again. This is illustrated by the gunpowder plot that you may have heard of. It was an attempt by secret Catholic English people to blow up the Protestant king and Protestant parliament in order to restore Catholicism in England. The gunpowder plot gave credit to the king's preservation of the status quo. It legitimized it, showing that there were tensions and that we needed to not tip the balance. The failure of the plot is still celebrated every 5th of November during what is known as Bonfire Night. And you can see popular interpretations of the gunpowder plot and Guy Fawkes in the TV series Gunpowder and of course the film V for Vendetta. James reinforced Anglicanism. You have the King James Bible, of course, that was written, or as it is known, the authorized version of the Bible in 1611. A new translation that became extremely influential on later English, British, American art and literature. But there was a potential clash between a monarch reigning in God's name, his political decisions being the expression of God's will, and Puritans who believed that they did God's work. So you have a problem. And the problem is, what does God really want? Very good question. Chocolate. No, more complex than that. This leads us to point number 3. Political crisis under the reign of Charles I. We've discussed the reign of James I, the father. Let's talk about the son. In 1625, James I's son, Charles I, inherited his father's bad finances. Remember, he was broke. Didn't have a penny to his name. Had the ambition to increase English power in Europe as well. You can see this portrait of him as a warrior king, sitting on his horse. But war, of course, was expensive, and economic crisis meant that there was even more resistance of local elites who had to pay. So once again, bloody tension. So you have the king who's saying, hey, Parliament, just give me some money. This led, of course, to instant clash with Parliament, which decided, with the king deciding to raise taxes without the Parliament's approval, imprisoning those who refused to pay. Maybe that rings a little bit of a bell by now. He claimed he answered to God alone, so the justification for that behavior was that he was doing what God wanted. He ruled with a limited number of councillors and made use of royal prerogative courts, that is to say, special courts that were in his favour, versus the autonomous common law judges that were not necessarily in his favour. So if that was not absolute power, it was certainly an increase in personal power. Now, Parliament's like, what the hell? Parliament resists. This was not a historical quote. Parliament resisted with the Petition of Rights in 1628, a key date for you to remember. Indeed, Parliament issued the Petition of Right that reminded Charles of its ancient privileges, liberties, and rights that were grounded in law, that were grounded in history. They revived Magna Carta, its memory, and promoted notions of an ancient mixed constitution and government by consent, approval, compromise. Charles' response? Well, 11 years of ruling without Parliament. Say, okay, Parliament, that's what you're coming up with? Okay, well then, bye, 11 years of tyranny, as it was called, the 11-year tyranny, because the king reigned without Parliament. Again, something for you to remember. Well, this was not exceptional per se, but his raising of new taxes, like ship money for instance, in the absence of Parliament was contentious. Ship money, for instance, was supposed to be raised in special times, in special places. You can imagine what kind of places, because it's called ship money, times of war, and the fact that he was trying to raise it in outside of those normal circumstances was extremely contentious. So there was denunciation of the 11 years tyranny. Charles fought Puritan reformers even more than his father had done, with Puritans being outlawed, jailed, even physically punished. Some of them were so fed up with the situation and the persecutions that they left for Holland or the colonies of New England and America, so you've got your Pilgrim Fathers there, to create an autonomous society. Then, the second in command of the church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, introduced a counter-reform, imposing new ceremonies to symbolize the superior power of the bishops and the king. So it was all about promoting the power of the king and putting the king back at the top of that pyramid. So you can see, for example, what we'll name the altar controversy that reignited tensions within the church. You've got modern Laudians, that is to say, people who are followers of Archbishop of Canterbury Lords, who want to revive the Laudian Mass. You can see here on the slides an English Puritan church in Holland with the central role of the sermon that is given with the prominent place where the sermon would have been delivered. Many interpreted these reforms as an attempt to convert England back to Catholicism. So it was disliked quite a lot. Now, we've mentioned phobia of Catholicism. Things got from bad to worse with Catholic persecution of Protestant martyrs under Mary Tudor. So you remember John Fox's Acts and Monuments, perhaps, with basically Protestants being persecuted, burnt at the stake during Bloody Mary's reign. Attempts by Catholic Spain to invade England with the Armada, the Gunpowder Plot. Basically, Catholics came to be seen as traitors to the state. You know, they had burned Protestants at the stake. They had tried to invade the country. They had led the Gunpowder Plot against parliaments. So obeying Catholics would have been bad because it would be like obeying a foreign power, because the Catholics obeyed a foreign power. Popery, that is to say, being associated and believing in the Pope, was associated with tyrannical rule, and you had examples of European Catholic monarchy and Catholic church hierarchies mutually reinforcing one another. For instance, we could mention Richelieu. You can't quite see behind those scenes of mayhem. But things went from phobia to paranoia in a way, like the, rumors of Catholic plots at courts, popish plots, basically suggesting that there was a plot to turn the king Catholic, with the Queen, French and Catholic Henrietta Maria, the poison in the king's ear, so she would have been the one trying to convert him to Catholicism. There were also beliefs in other plots. Charles, it was said, had already secretly converted to Catholicism and wanted to subvert both the church and the state. The restoration of Catholicism meant tyrannical rule, so it meant that it would have made him the Antichrist himself. Now, members of the gentry, such as John Pym, that you can see pictured on the slide, and members of the nobility, like the Earl of Essex, turned to Puritanism for spiritual reasons, but also to oppose the king's tyranny, because they believed in it, but also they wanted to make a stance against the tyranny of the king. They made the struggle for the survival of the Puritan faith synonymous with liberty. Fighting for Puritan faith meant fighting for liberty. And fighting against it meant that you were against liberty. So you have a large Puritan group in the parliamentary class that shared those beliefs. This leads to a breakdown of trust between court and country. But what did Charles really want to achieve? That's a big question, of course. Was he a frustrated tyrant? Absolute monarch, or at least trying to be one? Was he a modernizer of the apparatus of the state? Was he in favor of more efficiency, the reform of England's antiquated, old, obsolete tax structure? For his opponents, for sure, he was quite reactionary. So we can wonder whether he was persecuted, whether his opponents were persecuted heroes of liberty as they would have seen themselves, or reactionary elites that were very unhappy about losing their status. They didn't like the modernization of the state. They didn't want to lose their power and privileges if the administration was to be centralized. They wanted to keep their local power, so they wanted to keep private individual property as an individual principle because it served their own purposes, their own individual purposes. Now take a deep breath. This is point number 4, last point on today's agenda: outright rebellion. We begin with the war in Scotland because in their attempt to centralise power, both James I and Charles I wished to unite the Scottish and English states, as well as the Scottish and English crowns. They started with the church, the best instrument of social control. Charles I ordered the Scottish Church to adopt the English prayer book. But since reformer John Knox, the Kirk of Scotland, the Church of Scotland, was Calvinist, Protestant, a model for English Puritans that we've mentioned before. So they were hostile to Anglican rituals. Mainly the Scots refused English rule, and the king waged the unsuccessful bishops' wars on Scotland to try and pacify the situation in Scotland and quash that rebellion. The Scots themselves declared a holy war on Charles I. You can see here pictured in the slides the signing of the National Covenant, as they called it, under Edinburgh Castle in 1638. They decided to try, with the signing of the National Covenant, to create a national alliance against the king, a godly alliance against the Antichrist. Charles needed money for a second campaign against Scotland. I said bishop wars because there were two waves of it. He needed to ask his English subjects for money, because to get money he needed to ask Parliament, and of course the Scottish would not be giving money for him to wage war against them, right? So he was forced to call his English Parliament in 1640, the Parliament he hadn't called for 11 years. Now the king's critics could express their anger and frustration directly at him because they'd been called back. In 1641, the king, being isolated, was actually forced to accept constitutional revolution of his English parliament, with the idea that Parliament's power was not meant to be subordinate, but that it was meant to be coordinate to that of the monarch. So the king's advisors, like lords mentioned earlier, were tried and executed for monopolizing power. Parliament took control of the appointment of ministers of the army. Taxes were not to be voted except if Parliament agreed with them, so taxes not voted by Parliament were all declared illegal. The king was forced to call Parliament at least every 3 years to avoid situations such as the one of the 11 Years' Tyranny, and the royal prerogative courts were abolished to avoid the king ruling on his own. But there was a rebellion in Ireland as well. Ireland had been conquered by England in the 12th and 13th century, but there were two distinct separate states. You can see St. Patrick's Cross on the slide as well. 95% of the population were Irish natives. That is to say that they had strong Celtic roots and that they were Catholics. So they were double threats to Protestant England after the Reformation. So Henry VIII made himself King of Ireland, as one does, you know, that solves problems. And Elizabeth I encouraged plantations, between quotation marks, like the Ulster plantation. What it means is basically that the land was taken, the land was given to Protestant English farmers, the land was given to Protestant Scottish farmers. Colonization, basically, if that's what you're thinking. Now, in 1641, a native Irish rebellion against English and Scottish settlers started. In England, people saw this as like, oh my God, this really shows that the Irish are barbarians, and it shows that the Catholics are complete barbarians as well. This confirms all of fears. Charles I wanted to go to Ireland, but Parliament thought he would, in fact, join the Irish rebels. Remember that there were these suspicions that he was too friendly to the Catholics, Henrietta Maria, the poison in the king's ears, and so on and so forth. So there were fears that he would use the army against England. In 1642, Charles tried to have 5 members of the English Parliament arrested, including Pym, who's an important member of Parliament, in order to try and regain control over the Parliament, but he failed. This led to complete breakdown of trust, which tends to happen when you try to have members of Parliament arrested. I mean, usually they don't react that well to this. And this ultimately led to the outbreak of the Civil War, with the fight pitting the army of the king against the army of the Parliament. So what we have is basically a clash of conceptions of social power and a clash of conceptions of political power as well. Let's breathe. To conclude, we can say that we have 2 rival interpretations of England's political system, or constitution, so to speak. There's no written constitution. An ideology of order versus a community-based ideology. We also witnessed growing religious divisions. This resulted in a civil war between king and parliament. So now you can answer the question that we asked at the beginning of the lecture, which is how did we go from 1603, relative stability, to 1642, complete chaos and mayhem? So this resulted in a civil war. British roots of the Civil War are to be found in the question of marginal Scotland and Ireland resisting centralisation. So any questions that would include the idea of the British Isles throughout the periods would require you to really think about the part that was played by Scotland and Ireland. Now you can breathe. This was a very dense lecture. Feel free to pause, watch it again. You can use the timeline at the end of your booklets to check out the important dates. And of course, you can ask questions. I'm thinking in particular of the tutorials, during which you can feel free to ask any question you may want live to the person teaching the tutorials, whether it be me or someone else. On the next episode of Don't Lose Your Head, what we'll see is, well, you've probably guessed it by now, but we'll witness something that's probably going to be like, oh my god, is that a head being lost? That does look like a head being lost. Take care of yourselves and don't miss the next episode, basically.